Back in 2012, I worked as a part-time park ranger. Our small team was responsible for maintaining a section of the Appalachians that was known for its thick forests and occasional wildfires. The team included me, a 22-year-old woman, Jason, a 25-year-old guy, and our supervisor, Olivia, who was around our age as well. We also had our captain, who drove the truck and operated the water pump. One afternoon we were on duty patrolling a remote area when a local guy approached us, saying he saw smoke coming from a valley a couple of miles away. It was our responsibility to investigate any reports of fire, so we grabbed our gear and followed the man to the edge of a steep drop. He pointed out a path that required us to use ropes to descend. Being young, inexperienced, and eager to do our jobs, we decided to go for it. As we started to descend, the man said he'd catch up with us after grabbing his canteen, which seemed odd since he had been carrying a large jug. But we shrugged it off. Once we reached the valley floor, we realized how isolated we were. The valley walls were steep, and the only way out was to follow the riverbed for a couple of miles. I started to feel uneasy but kept my concerns to myself. As we walked along, the man with us started talking about random things, mostly incoherent rambling. He had a camera slung around his neck, and he suddenly asked if he could take a picture of me, because I reminded him of his daughter's friend from high school. I insisted on a group picture, but he kept pushing for one of just me and Olivia, saying something about the girls in the photo. Thankfully, Jason stepped in, insisting on the group shot and staying close to us the entire time. The man didn't press further, but his behavior was becoming increasingly odd. As we continued walking, we came across a series of small waterfalls with ladders built into the rock to help people climb down. These were check dams, meant to control water flow. The man went down first, followed by Olivia, then me, with Jason last. Each time, the man would reach out to help us down by grabbing us around the waist or by the hips, which made both of us very uncomfortable. After the third dam, Jason pulled me aside and asked how I felt about this guy. I told him I didn't trust him, and Olivia agreed. The man's camera clicks were becoming more frequent, and he was talking more about how much I reminded him of this friend of his daughter's. His comments were making my skin crawl, and I felt something wasn't right. We approached another fork in the riverbed. The man insisted we take the left path, even though it was uphill and the opposite direction from where he claimed he saw the smoke. He mentioned something about a really cool cave he wanted to show us, and he started calling me by the name of his daughter's friend. This was the breaking point. Jason, pretending to pick up a radio call, announced that we had to go back immediately. The man looked frustrated and tried to convince us to continue, but we made our excuses and headed back. I could feel his eyes on me the entire way. We managed to find a low spot to climb out of the valley and called our truck to come pick us up. When the truck finally arrived, the man stayed behind, watching us from a distance. As soon as our vehicle pulled up, he disappeared into the trees. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, but I can't help but think about what might have happened if we hadn't turned back when we did. It wasn't as terrifying as some of the stories you hear, but the whole thing was incredibly creepy, and I'm glad we got out when we did. When I was about 8, my dad took my brother and me to a cabin deep in the woods of Minnesota for a summer vacation. We brought along our family cat, which I was really happy about. We each had our own rooms in the cabin. Mine was the furthest from everyone else, right by where the woods started. There was a large window next to my bed, and a tree grew right next to it. I had tried climbing the tree the day before but couldn't get very far. One night I was feeling homesick and couldn't sleep. The cat was curled up beside me, and I was reading a comic book with a flashlight when, around 2 a.m., I heard a tapping on my window. I figured it was just a branch, given the wind outside, and tried to ignore it. But then I heard a whisper. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I froze, feeling a chill run through my body. The whispering continued, and I could just make out what was being said. "Open up, kiddo, it's Dad. Let me in." My heart pounded. I knew it wasn't my dad. The voice was wrong. My imagination ran wild, thinking it might be a ghost or something worse, like a monster from one of my comic books. My cat started hissing and clawing at the window, and I buried my face in his fur, holding him tight. The whispering grew more insistent, with phrases like, "Come on, it's Dad, I'm cold out here," and "I just want to give you a hug." I was paralyzed with fear, too scared to move or call out for help. Then I heard a scraping sound. I turned to see a man's face pressed against the glass, grinning maniacally. He was dragging a knife along the window, making a screeching noise that sent shivers down my spine. I finally found my voice and screamed as loudly as I could. The man's expression changed to shock and then anger, and he disappeared. Seconds later, my dad burst into the room, holding his hunting rifle. I told him what happened, and he rushed outside, but the man was already gone. My dad stayed up the rest of the night, keeping watch. None of us got any sleep. The next day, we packed up and left. My dad filed a report with the local sheriff, and they asked me to describe the man, but I don't know if they ever caught him. To this day, I'm grateful to my cat for being there and for making me feel safe when I was so scared. He's 14 now, and still as feisty as ever. A couple of summers ago, my boyfriend and I decided to go camping in the Ozark National Forest in northern Arkansas. After our experience, we've decided not to return unless we're with a larger group of people. We're from Dallas, and the Ozarks had always been our go-to place for some relaxation. We'd been hiking in the area before and loved it, but this trip made us reconsider. Our plan was to hike a secluded section of the Ozark Highlands Trail. We wanted to do a 10-mile hike to a designated campsite, spend the night, and hike back to our car the following day. We stayed at a friend's place in Little Rock the night before and set out early the next day. The drive into the forest was peaceful, with lush trees and winding roads. We felt completely alone, in a good way, as we made our way to the trailhead. On the drive, we passed a rusty old pickup truck parked on the side of the road, with two guys standing next to it. They looked like stereotypical mountain men, complete with long beards and flannel shirts. As we drove by, I waved, but they didn't wave back. They just stared at us. In the rearview mirror, I saw them continue to watch us until we were out of sight. I joked with my boyfriend about how unfriendly the locals were, but we didn't think much more about it. We reached the trailhead, which was completely deserted. Perfect for the solitude we were seeking. We locked up the car, shouldered our packs, and set off down the trail. The hike was beautiful. We passed through thick forests, over bubbling streams, and across rocky bluffs. After about 6 hours, we reached the campsite. It was a small clearing with a fire ring and a wooden picnic table. We set up our tent near the edge of the clearing, feeling secure in our isolation. We built a small fire and ate our dehydrated meals while watching the sunset. The night sky filled with stars, and we marveled at the beauty of it all. By the time the fire died down, we were both exhausted. We crawled into our tent, and before long, my boyfriend was asleep. I lay there, feeling uneasy, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I was finally drifting off when a sound jolted me awake. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping sound, like someone knocking two pieces of wood together. My boyfriend woke up, and we both listened in silence. The sound was coming from somewhere nearby, but we couldn't see out of the tent. We stayed still, straining our ears to catch any other noises. Then we heard voices. Low and indistinct at first, then louder. 2 or 3 people were talking, though we couldn't make out what they were saying. The voices seemed to be moving closer. Fear gripped us. We were miles from anyone, with no cell phone signal and no weapon except a small pocket knife. We stayed still, barely breathing, hoping they would go away. After what felt like hours, the knocking stopped, and the voices faded. We lay there, too scared to move, listening to the insects buzzing in the night. At first light, we cautiously left the tent. The campsite was empty, but when we went over to the picnic table, we saw the word "leave" carved into the wood. The ground around the table was littered with fresh wood chips. My heart pounded as we quickly packed up our gear. We left the site as fast as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders. When we got back to our car, the windshield wipers were pulled up, and a dead bird was placed on the hood. Blood was smeared across the windshield. I didn't even take the time to clean it off. We threw our gear in the back and sped out of the forest. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. We didn't stop until we reached the outskirts of Little Rock. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something terrible that night. We haven't been back to the Ozarks since, and I don't think we ever will. When I was 19, my friends and I loved exploring abandoned places. There was a wooded area near our town in Oregon, and a storm drain emptied into a creek there. It was one of our favorite spots to hang out. On one of our trips, my friends Max, Jake, and I decided to go check it out. We took 2 cars meeting at the edge of the woods. We hiked through the forest, joking around and enjoying the day. The storm drain had 2 large entrances side by side, each about 10 feet high. Once inside, there was a steep incline leading up to a series of concrete pillars. The tunnels eventually merged into one, and we'd climb to the top to see how far we could go. On this day, it had recently rained, so the tunnels were flooded. We decided to turn back since we didn't want to get soaked. By then it was getting dark, and we noticed how little light was coming from the entrance. As we got closer, Max, who was leading the way, stopped and whispered to me, "There's some guy out there with a clown mask." At first I thought he was joking, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We all looked out, and sure enough, a tall man in a dirty white clown mask was walking a bike down the path, picking up sticks and putting them into a bag slung over his shoulder. The mask covered his entire face, and he was wearing a tattered gray hoodie and cargo pants. We watched silently, unsure of what to do. The guy didn't seem to notice us at first, but then he stopped and turned his head, looking straight in our direction. My heart skipped a beat. Jake and Max decided to head back to their car, feeling uneasy. I stayed with Paul, wanting to see what this guy was up to. We climbed up the hill to stay hidden but close enough to keep an eye on him. The man continued to gather sticks, seemingly oblivious to us. As it got darker, the forest grew quieter. We lost sight of the man, but then we heard the crunch of leaves. Suddenly he emerged from behind a bush, moving quickly, his head darting around. He stood in the middle of the path, looking straight ahead for a few seconds before grabbing his bike and walking in the direction Jake and Max had gone. Paul called them, telling them to hurry back to their car. We decided to go to the other parking area, hoping to avoid him. As we walked, it was now pitch black, and we were using our phone flashlights to navigate. Then, out of nowhere, we heard what sounded like laughter all around us, echoing through the trees. It was loud, eerie, and seemed to come from all directions. We bolted, running through the woods until we reached the parking lot. We jumped into Jake's car, our hearts pounding. As we sped away, the laughter stopped. We didn't see the man again, but to this day, I have no idea who he was or what he was doing in those woods. The clown mask, the laughter, it all felt like a nightmare. I've never gone back to that forest, and I don't think I ever will. When I was in my early 20s, I had a friend named Lisa whose father was an alcoholic. Lisa lived in a small coastal town, and occasionally we'd visit her dad, who lived alone a few miles out of town. My relationship with him was always tense and uncomfortable, but that's not the point of this story. One night, after a particularly bad argument, her father kicked us out of the house. It was around midnight, and we didn't have a car since we had gotten a ride there. His house was about 3 miles from town down a long dirt road, so we started walking. Lisa was upset, crying and venting about her dad as we walked. When we finally reached the town, we found a payphone to call my parents, who lived about an hour away. I called them, explained the situation, and they agreed to come pick us up. While waiting, we sat on a bench next to the phone booth. As we sat there, a van pulled up and parked right behind us, no more than 15 feet away. There were 2 young men in the front seats, and they were staring at us. The sliding door of the van opened, and I saw that there were several more men in the back. My stomach dropped. The place was deserted. No houses nearby and no people around. Just a long, empty road. I stood up to get a better look, and the men in the van started talking among themselves. Their voices grew louder, and it became clear they were talking about us. I heard phrases like grab them and take them for a ride. I was terrified. Lisa was still crying, not even aware of what was happening. I knew I had to say something to her, but I was so scared I could hardly move or speak. Just then, out of nowhere, Lisa's father's car appeared. He had calmed down and decided to come find us. He pulled up, got out of the car, and hugged Lisa, apologizing. The whole time I couldn't take my eyes off the van. The men had stopped talking and were just watching us. "Let's go," I said, urging them to the car. We got in, and Lisa's father started driving back to his house. The van started following us. I tried to tell him what was going on, but he didn't seem to understand the seriousness. "Just slow down and let them pass," he said. But they didn't pass. Instead, they followed us all the way back to his driveway, then stopped at the end. We sat in the car, watching them, while they just sat in the van watching us. After a long standoff, the van finally backed up and drove away. My parents arrived shortly after, worried because we hadn't been where I said we'd be. Lisa's father retreated into the house, avoiding any more confrontation. I went back to my parents' house, shaken and scared. I never reported it to the police. I don't remember why. Maybe I was too overwhelmed or thought it wouldn't matter. But that night changed me. I became more cautious, more fearful. I learned that there really are people out there who mean you harm, and sometimes you're just lucky to get away. When I was about 18, a group of my friends and I drove out to a music festival held in a large field in eastern Kentucky. After an exhausting but fun day, we piled back into the car around 9 p.m. to head home. The festival grounds were remote, surrounded by dense forest, and the only way back was along a narrow highway with no lights. We were driving along, chatting and laughing, when we noticed a car speeding up behind us. It was a dark SUV, and it quickly closed the gap. We moved into the right lane to let it pass, which it did, but then it slowed down to match our speed. None of us thought much of it at first, assuming the driver had been in a hurry, but now was taking it easy. A few minutes later, we realized we weren't going as fast as we should be. The SUV in front of us had slowed down to 45 miles per hour, 10 below the speed limit. Our driver, Rachel, mumbled something about how weird it was but didn't take any action. We continued chatting, but soon the SUV slowed even more, down to 35, then 30. Rachel was getting annoyed. "What is this guy doing?" she muttered, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel. We all watched as the SUV slowed to a crawl, then came to a complete stop right in the middle of the road. By now, we were all starting to feel uneasy. Another car approached from behind, and as it passed us, the SUV started moving again, picking up speed and staying just ahead of us. Our sense of unease turned to fear as the SUV began to slow down again after the other car disappeared. This time, it dropped to 20, then 15, and finally just stopped. Rachel was freaking out, asking what she should do. Some of the girls were crying, and I felt a wave of panic. One of my friends suggested speeding past them, but I was worried they might try to run us off the road. Being behind them seemed safer, at least for now. Our phones had no reception, adding to the tension. It felt like we were in a horror movie. We decided to turn around. Rachel did a quick U-turn, and we headed back the way we came, our hearts racing. We drove until we found a rest area, pulling off and turning off the car lights to wait. After about 20 minutes, we saw headlights approaching, and a large truck passed by, heading in the same direction we had been going. We pulled out behind the truck, hoping to use it as cover. As we approached the spot where the SUV had been, it was nowhere to be seen. We sped past, staying close behind the truck until we were far away from that area. To this day, I don't know what those people were up to. Maybe it was just a cruel prank, but it felt like something far more sinister. I've never been so scared in my life, and every time I think back on that night, I wonder if we narrowly escaped something terrible.